Hi everyone, this is Jewish history class. We are approaching the end of the semester, and today's topic is Jews in the United States and other parts of the diaspora after the Second World War. We will move on from this and talk about the state of Israel next, and that will be some of the concluding parts of our class here. So after the Second World War, Jews in America became, we might say, fully assimilated, right? And this, despite the fact that there were Jews immigrating from Europe after the Holocaust, thousands of them. I don't have exact statistics or anything, but thousands of them ended up in the United States. They ended up in other parts of the Western Hemisphere. Many went to places like Argentina and Mexico, which came to have, and Canada, which came to have fairly significant Jewish communities. Of course, a very large number of them ended up in Israel, especially after Israeli independence in 1948. And they went to other parts of the world too. We'll look at a map a little later that shows the largest Jewish communities in the world at present, or at least in recent times. But a huge number of them ended up in the United States. And, despite coming directly from Europe and from different backgrounds in Europe, some more assimilated than others, within a generation or so, these Jews became very assimilated into American life, really became, this is the thing, when we said this earlier about the United States and its unique position in the history of the diaspora, but it's here really for the first time in Jewish history, after the creation, or after the kind of establishment of the diaspora condition in ancient times, that Jews were able to live without really standing out from the rest of society, at least not in any great way. There continued to be anti-Semitism in the United States, even some fairly ugly incidents, but they stood out more for the fact that they went against the norm than that they were part of the norm, right? Jews became part of, for lack of a better term, white America after World War II. And that was already underway before the war, even in the 19th century perhaps, but even more the case after the Second World War, especially when anti-Semitism and its consequences became, well, unthinkable after the Holocaust, right? There's a real, we might say, decline in racism and especially in anti-Semitism after the revelations of the Holocaust. And American Jews benefit from that in terms of assimilation. But on the other hand, I mean, the real challenge for Jews, we might say, was retaining their identity as Jews. And this is perhaps the most important theme, and we could maybe even just stop at this, because the rest of what we're going to be looking at are really just kind of case studies or manifestations of this. But we have the clash between the American value of individualism and the long-standing thread that runs through Jewish history, which is of close-knit communities that stay together in order to protect themselves and to retain their identity. Well, the United States did not present a lot of threats to Jews, especially after the Second World War. The threat was that Jews would just be swallowed up in this great atmosphere of American individualism and cease to be Jews in any way other than, ancestry, perhaps, which some Jews may or may not have even known, right, whether they were descended from Jews. And so, the challenge here is retaining identity in the face of a society that values individualism and being whatever you want to be and achieving whatever dreams you want to achieve, such that being Jewish was no longer even an important part of what many Jews valued or what they were striving for. Okay, hopefully that made sense. And this, the lack of community became even more apparent and even more of a challenge to retaining Jewish identity after the Second World War because of the changing urban landscape. Up to this point, most Jews, and this is not certainly all of them, there are exceptions, but most Jews had congregated, especially with the major waves of migration in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, in cities. New York City, certainly the largest Jewish community, but places like Chicago and Philadelphia and even Los Angeles had large numbers of Jews in them. They lived in the city. They tended to live in Jewish neighborhoods. Well, Jews followed the demographic trend after the Second World War and began to move out of the inner cities into suburbs, and often moved away from distinctly Jewish communities into just sort of melting pot suburban communities where they would live next to maybe even have entire neighborhoods full of people who were not Jews, and the challenge of retaining their Jewish identity was even more apparent here. Now, one of the things that did allow for Jews to retain some kind of cohesion was the issue of Israel. In fact, if Jews associated with Judaism, it tended to go along with a support for the state of Israel after Israeli independence in 1948. And, Jews took pride that their fellow Jews had created this country and had emerged from the Holocaust, although the Holocaust was not actually a theme that many Jews discussed or a kind of marker of identity in the 1950s and perhaps into the early 60s. We'll talk a little bit more about the American Jews' relationship with the Holocaust a bit later. But in the decade or a decade and a half or maybe 2 decades after the war, American Jews did not talk much about the Holocaust. Because it was a narrative of Jewish powerlessness. And the message for many Jews, and I'm not kind of making this up, this comes from a well-respected monograph by a scholar named Peter Novick called The Holocaust in American Life. Jews were discouraged from discussing the Holocaust or even thinking about it much because it ran so counter to the kind of life they were trying to establish for themselves in the United States, where they were, trying to fit in and trying to establish that, they could be successful and have power and all of this. And the Holocaust really didn't jive very well with that. And so Jewish Americans were not much discussing the Holocaust until maybe the early 1960s when some things began to change, and I'll bring that up a bit later. But Israel was something that they talked about, and for the most part they supported this, especially as Israel faced a number of challenges to its existence, attacks from surrounding countries in the 1950s, and we'll discuss this at greater length, of course, in the video lecture on Israel. But American Jews were, for the most part, in this early period post-Israeli independence, very supportive of Israel. That's going to change with the Six-Day War to some extent, where Jews become more polarized, but I'll bring that up later. And so if Jews did retain any sort of Jewish identity or association with Judaism, it tended to be through belonging to a synagogue. And most American Jews were either Reform or conservative in this period. There's going to be later an Orthodox revival, which I'll talk about. There were, and these are, we're talking here, given Jews are moving into the suburbs like most other white Americans. Reform and conservative synagogues were established in the suburbs of major cities, and Jews went to these like. White Christian Americans went to church maybe a few times a year, especially on major life events, celebrating circumcisions or weddings or The most important thing, perhaps, the most important event in the life of a young Jew was the bar mitzvah. And this being America, there was some desire for equality, and so they established this for both boys and girls. The bat mitzvah for a Jewish girl became nearly as common as a bar mitzvah for a young Jewish boy, and that was sort of the coming of age marker for young Jews. And that, went along with learning a bit about the Jewish heritage, learning some Hebrew so they could do a Torah reading during the bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah. And so young Jews, whose families were associated with these reform or conservative synagogues would attend perhaps a couple of hours a week for a little while, for a year or two or three when they were young. A Hebrew school in the afternoons where they would learn a bit of Hebrew, learn a bit of their heritage. But this did not lend itself, and this is similar to, Catholic children going to catechism classes and preparing for their first communion, or, children of other faiths maybe going to some kind of Sunday school, or perhaps a brief youth seminary experience or something like that. This was fairly common, and then the Jews fit into that major religious trend. This did not necessarily lend itself to mastery of even the most basic tenets and rituals of Judaism, right? This was something that one did to become part of a community, to establish one's identity, maybe to celebrate one's heritage. And when there was a wedding or a funeral or another ceremony that Jews tended to be pretty faithful about attending was the Yartzeit, the commemoration of their parents' deaths after, and this would have been, of course, older Jews who were doing this, where they would say the Yizkor prayers and things to remember the dearly departed and all of that, right? But Judaism was not a religion necessarily, especially in this atmosphere, that was a kind of lived experience constantly. Instead, the Jewish identity lent itself to things like, social justice issues and the establishment of charities. Many of these charities would do things like raise funds for the state of Israel and for other charitable causes. Jews got involved in, community organizations. They set up things like community centers where Jewish children would go to play basketball or baseball or participate in other activities, and there were Jews who were involved in things like Boy Scouting and things like this, right? 4-H, summer camps for Jews were fairly common if they didn't, go to kind of assimilated summer camps. There were Jewish community organizations that did things like summer camps. And so, this was the way that the Jewish experience was lived for many, maybe most American Jews in the couple of decades after the war. The 1960s affected Jewish youth like it affected youth all across America, right? A general rebellion, a coming of age of the baby boomer generation, a general rebellion against the powers that be, a questioning of the American system, especially things like capitalism and free markets, and what Dwight Eisenhower called the military-industrial complex. And with that came a questioning even of those things that had been so closely associated with Jewish identity, like the State of Israel. We'll talk about the Six-Day War in 1967 that brought the occupied territories, as they came to be called, the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, the Golan Heights, into the orbit of, or rather into the control of the State of Israel. And many Jewish youth saw Israel just as a kind of neo-colonial enterprise, and this, and even perhaps an extension of the American military-industrial complex. And some of them turned against Israel, especially given the situation in the occupied territories. Not all of them, and many of them later changed their minds and became pro-Israel again. But there was this general rebellion, like there was in the general population. At the same time, Jews were becoming heavily involved in the civil rights movement, and this is part of a larger trend that was discussed very well in the chapter on kind of modern American Jews in the WWII book. Jews and African Americans have had a long association in things like the entertainment field, the civil rights movement, certainly. At the upper right of the slide here, you can see Martin Luther King flanked by a couple of rabbis, as well as, I believe, by a Catholic bishop there. There were a lot of Jewish leaders, rabbis, and others who marched with King, there were Jewish youth organizations who conducted voter drives to register black voters in the South. There were Jews killed in these efforts, right? And this became a kind of mark of pride. General consensus has been that Jews were heavily involved in this in the 50s and early 60s, but with the establishment of a kind of militant Black Power movement, and especially with the rise of figures like Elijah Muhammad and Louis Farrakhan, and the establishment of the Nation of Islam, which had an anti-Semitic and especially anti-Israel bent to it, that Jews turned away from this. There has been, I did a bit of research on this in preparation for this class, there's been a rethinking of this to some extent, and a suggestion that Jews, especially Zionists in America, were taking cues from the Black Power movement, and vice versa. The Black Power movement was taking cues from Zionists, that these were actually kind of reinforcing what each other were doing. So it's a much more nuanced and complicated relationship between the two. But this is still today a mark of pride. There was a monument, I believe, at the Bayfront Hilton in St. Augustine, or a plaque or something that mentions the rabbis involved in the civil rights movement in St. Augustine. So this is something certainly that we should mention as we talk about American Jews after the Second World War. In no field did Jews thrive quite like entertainment, and that may be too much hyperbole, I don't know. I mean, Jews thrived in a lot of different fields in second half of the 20th century America, but it is really astounding to note. I maybe encourage you to just frankly go to the Wikipedia page for a list of Jewish entertainers and take a look at all of the famous people who have Jewish backgrounds. Many of them were born with very kind of Ashkenazic names. Kirk Douglas is one who comes to mind. He was born Isser Danielovich in 1916, right? And changed his name to Kirk Douglas for the stage and screen. But Jews thrived in every part of entertainment. In the WWII book, there's a long discussion about Jews helping to, again, here's the association between Jews and African Americans, helping to push forward jazz as the American musical form. And so figures like George Gershwin and Irving Berlin, Jewish American composers, were heavily involved in this, in the innovation of music that occurred in the early to mid 20th century. At one point, there was some kind of counting done. I think this was in the 1970s or 80s or something, that showed that something like 75% of all comedians in Hollywood and entertainment were Jews. This stretches all the way from early figures like Groucho Marx, pictured here on the slide, through popular comedians like Jerry Lewis and Danny Kaye in the 1940s and 50s and 60s, up through figures like Jerry Seinfeld. And in fact, if you look at the Seinfeld cast here, I'm kind of a big Seinfeld fan, though the show has not aged well. But of the four principal actors, three of them are Jewish and quite openly Jewish. Jerry Seinfeld, Julie Louis-Dreyfus, and Jason Alexander. All three of them, and Jason Alexander in particular has been, associated with, or he's been involved with organizations trying to do grassroots peace building in Israel, Palestine, and things. Michael Richards, I believe, is the only one who's not Jewish of the four. But even more recent figures like Lena Dunham, right? These are all Jewish Americans, and who have talked about, in some cases at least, the influence that their Jewish background has on their choices in entertainment. Famous singers, Paul Simon comes to mind. Bob Dylan was, born to, well, he was from Jewish heritage, and so, real innovators and very famous entertainers were Jewish, and so this is one field certainly where Jews thrived a great deal and continue to do so. Religiously, there were revivals, and that term I'm using very loosely here, but some tremendous changes really in the religious makeup of Jewish communities in America in the 1960s through 1980s. And this occurs in both kind of Reform and conservative on the one hand, and Orthodox on the other hand. There's a real Orthodox revival that happens in, starting in, well, maybe dating back to the 1950s, but really gaining momentum in the 60s and 70s. The Reform and conservative revival, in kind of broad terms here, right? Jews in this period, many of them at least, began to evince a desire to take their religion more seriously, to have perhaps greater engagement with Jewish issues, to become more involved in synagogues. Some of this is part and parcel with an increased awareness of the Holocaust and the effects of the Holocaust and what that meant for the world Jewish community. The Jews decided that, if so many of our fellow Jews were killed in the Holocaust, we probably ought to keep this thing going. And I'll talk about why that happens in a minute here. But that, in addition to, the ever-present question of Israel and all of this, led in general to a greater engagement with Jewish affairs and to the establishment even within these large suburban synagogues, of these things called havarot. That just means in Hebrew fellowship. But these were smaller groups, some of them within larger synagogues and some of them independent of synagogues, where Jews would get together and support each other in their life events, but also in many cases get together and read the Torah and perhaps other Jewish sacred texts together, where they would talk about Jewish affairs. This was not an Orthodox thing, though. They were not returning to the traditional rituals or traditional dress or anything like that. It was more of a greater tie to a Jewish community and to the Jewish tradition more generally. And this ran hand in hand with the prevalence of things like feminism within the Jewish communities. Jewish girls and women became interested in learning more about their heritage and even participating more directly. The move to create bat mitzvahs and to make those common was part of this, but so was, and this is discussed in the WWII book at some length as well, so was the desire among some Jewish women to seek rabbinical training. And at Hebrew Union College, the major kind of reform seminary in America in Cincinnati, in the 1960s, the leaders there finally decided that it was time for women to be ordained as rabbis. The first female rabbi, Sally Priesand, who is pictured at the top part of the top right of the slide here, was ordained in 1972. The conservative Jews were less willing initially to go that far, but even by the mid-1980s, there were female rabbis being ordained even in conservative synagogues, and women became more and more involved. And this is part and parcel of the Jews' involvement in things like the equal rights movement. This is one of the community outreach issues that the Jews get involved in. Polls were done during the move to create the Equal Rights Amendment in the late 60s and early 70s, looking at different communities, and Jewish women were by far the largest supporters. I mean, if you're talking just percentage-wise, meaning the percent of Jewish women who support the Equal Rights Amendment, Jewish women were, of all the demographic groups in America, the most supportive of this. And it goes beyond that. Jewish men were more supportive of the Equal Rights Amendment than non-Jewish women were. Okay, so this was not just something happening among Jewish women. Jewish men were firmly in support of the Equal Rights Amendment as well, and that comes out of this move to greater engagement with Jewish affairs and the general kind of trend of feminism having an influence on the way that Judaism develops. As the Orthodox revival got going, and as more and more Jews were taking the Orthodox route, this influence, and I'll talk about that in just a second here, but conservative and even Reform communities realized that a couple of hours a week was not sufficient for young Jewish children to gain any sort of knowledge about their tradition that would be lasting and meaningful. And so, within the conservative communities, there were this period saw the establishment of Jewish day schools that kind of were modeled after what was going on in Orthodox Jewish communities, where Jews would attend school as Jews and learn Hebrew, and then they would also learn other subjects as well. They would do their math and their science and their history and all of that, but they would also learn how to read Hebrew, learn to and study the Torah and maybe even the Talmud, and really engage themselves with the Jewish tradition and with sacred texts. There's also an Orthodox revival, and this dates back to the immigration of a fair number of Hasidic refugees after the Second World War. And the thing about Hasidic communities is that they retained their communal identity maybe better than any other Jewish communities in the world. Because, if you recall about the Hasidic tradition, these communities are centered on the leadership of the Rebbe, the Hasid, right? And so they have a charismatic leader, they follow him, and whole communities of these Jews had immigrated, some of them before the war, some of them after the war, those who survived, and they continued to retain that cohesion. And so in places like, Brooklyn and Manhattan, but also, in some other cities in America too, there were whole neighborhoods or perhaps a whole kind of block of brownstone houses or something who were all part of the same Hasidic community. And this lent a sort of momentum to, orthodoxy, especially in the urban environment, particularly in New York City. But that didn't necessarily spread to the other Jews in America until the so-called Lubavitcher movement started its proselytizing activity. Now, let me give a little background here. This is one of the most important forces in modern Judaism, initially in the United States, but later kind of spreading all through the world. The Lubavitcher community is so named because they had lived in a place called Lubavitch, which I believe is in the Ukraine. It's either Ukraine or Lithuania, but they later moved to Poland. Anyway, they'd been in Eastern Europe. This dates back to the late 18th century, and there's a whole kind of tradition of rebbes who stood at the center of this particular Hasidic community. After the war, and they immigrated to the United States in the 1930s, and the entire community moved to New York. Right after the war, the leaders of the Lubavitch community began to do public outreach, and specifically, and by public outreach, I don't mean to the broader community, I mean to other Jews. They began to set up displays on street corners and engaging other Jews in conversation and encouraging them, and not necessarily pressuring them, but encouraging them to be more Jewish. They began to educate other Jews on things like Jewish ceremony, encourage them to incorporate traditional ceremonies into their Jewish lives, to light candles at Hanukkah, or to, sincerely engage with a Seder service during Passover, or whatever it was. They began to put out educational materials, sort of targeting their fellow Jews, even Reform and conservative Jews who had mostly distanced themselves from this traditional life. And they were tremendously successful, especially after the previous Rebbe died, and I forget what his name was, but the new Rebbe took over in 1951. His name was Menachem Mendel Schneerson. He's pictured at the lower right of the slide here. He is simply known as the Lubavitcher Rebbe. The Lubavitcher Rebbe. And he began to, he increased this outreach, this proselytizing. They had these, what they called mitzvah mobiles, these kind of buses or vans that they would drive around, park on a street, and hand out materials. In a way, it's kind of like the Gideon Bible Association, or even the Mormons or the Jehovah's Witnesses, right, who preach to their fellow Christians or fellow users of the Christian Bible, but specifically targeting their fellow Jews. Rabbi Menachem Mendel was especially charismatic. He was beloved of his people. After his death in 1994, many even proclaimed him to be the Messiah, and he himself had preached about the imminence of the coming of the Messiah, that he was going to be there soon, it was going to come soon, and that the Jews all over the world needed to prepare themselves for this. And so he saw this as a kind of immediate and urgent need to get Jews to be more Jewish. If you're hearing background noise, I live right by train tracks, and a train just went by, so hopefully you can still hear me just fine. Anyway, there's more we could say about the Lubavitcher movement, and if you're interested in this, I might encourage you. I've been in New York and seen these Lubavitcher mobiles, these vans, on the streets of Manhattan. They're still very much doing this. His followers proclaimed him to be the Messiah. He himself had not specifically stated that he was the Messiah. He did make sort of reference. He talked about the Messiah a lot, and some of his followers interpreted some of his words to be a kind of claim to be the Messiah. And so this is one of the reasons he got that reputation. Okay, let's move on here. And so, partly inspired by the success of the Lubavitcher movement, and um, partly as an outgrowth of just sort of religious feeling, religious fervor, with the well, with the maturation of the baby boomer generation and the beginnings of Generation X. There's a general trend in the United States to greater religious piety. And so, many Jews began to take a more orthodox route. And here I'm talking very generally, these are general trends we're talking about, right? So this is not to suggest there's any individual application here, right? This is just generally speaking. And this is especially the case in New York City, where Orthodox Jewry really had a great revival in the kind of 60s through 80s. Many of these Jews began to refer to themselves, or to be referred to, as the Baalei Teshuvah. In Hebrew, that means the repentant ones, or literally means the masters of repentance. And but this even extended to the suburbs. That Jews who grew up in the suburbs and had kind of this very casual association with the synagogue and with their Jewish identity started to move into the cities where they could be more closely associated with their fellow Orthodox Jews, and they didn't necessarily change their outward appearance. They didn't start growing their side locks, or wearing kaftans, or dressing like the Hasidic Jews. But they did perhaps put on yarmulkes, right? And wear the fringe garments, and these other things that were more common among the Orthodox. It became a common sight in meetings in the business world, in accounting firms, in law firms, and other things, to see partners in these firms, or junior associates, wearing the traditional head covering, or at least a kippah or a yarmulke. In any case, this is the general trend, and it's especially the case in New York and some other urban environments. Many of these Baalei Teshuvah, these kind of newly Orthodox or modern Orthodox, also immigrated to Israel, feeling that they could not live a full Jewish life in America, where so many people were assimilated, that they needed to move to the Jewish state. And so there's a fair amount of Jewish immigration to Israel in this same period. I mentioned the Holocaust a couple of times here. Let me talk about that with a little more intent for just a minute. There were a few events that made the Holocaust more real for America generally, but specifically for American Jews, and increased its prevalence as a major marker of American Jewish identity. The first of these was the international trial of Adolf Eichmann, who, as I mentioned, was, in an earlier lecture, was captured by Israeli Secret Service in Argentina in 1961, was taken clandestinely to Jerusalem, where he underwent a trial, and where he was executed for crimes against humanity, which was the only crime permitted capital punishment in Israel generally, right? So the Eichmann trial was broadcast all over the world, and American Jews tuned into this. And it was from this point that American Jews began to talk a lot more about the Holocaust, began to explore it more, began to incorporate this into their synagogues, or discussion of their synagogue services, began to take a greater interest generally, began to go on kind of pilgrimages to the concentration camps, to places like Auschwitz, and to really have some sort of personal link, right, to think about this. And this again from the first couple of decades after the war. The Holocaust was almost a taboo subject for American Jews, but it became common to talk about it. And there were a few other events that precipitated this. In the late 1970s, there was a mini-series simply called The Holocaust that aired on American television and had for the Jews an effect similar to the miniseries Roots had for African Americans. If you don't know what Roots was, I don't want to go necessarily into details, but it was an exploration of kind of the slave heritage. Well, the Holocaust miniseries did a similar thing for Jews. There was a massively long documentary called Shoah made around the same period that became sort of required watching for Jews. Synagogues, would air this, and this, all led up to what was perhaps the most important or most influential of all pop cultural depictions of the Holocaust, which was the 1993 film Schindler's List by Steven Spielberg. Spielberg himself is an interesting study in these trends. He was of Jewish heritage, like many in the entertainment industry. But became sort of more and more connected to his Jewish heritage as he, proceeded through his middle age. And he made Schindler's List and later made a documentary called The Last Days about the destruction of the Hungarian Jewish community in 1944. Really to connect with these Jewish roots. He would go on to make the film Munich, about the 1972 killing by PLO terrorists of Israeli athletes at the Munich Olympic Games, and the Israeli response to that, right? And so he went through this whole kind of phase of his career where he was really exploring his Jewish heritage and Jewish issues. Schindler's List kicked into high gear discussion of the Holocaust by the end of the 20th century, and I remember talking about this because this is around the time I was heading off to grad school in Jewish studies, that if you went to a Barnes & Noble anywhere in the U.S. or frankly anywhere in the world and went to the Judaicist section, which there usually is one in a Barnes & Noble, or there was at that point anyway, 90% of all of the books on the Judaicist section were about the Holocaust, right? So this was... and this led one Jewish American scholar, Norman Finkelstein, to write a book called The Holocaust Industry, kind of criticizing the fact that the Holocaust had been commodified for the appetite of these American Jews trying to connect in some way with the atrocities of Jewish history, right? So anyway, the Holocaust was a really important lodestone, as it were, or cornerstone of American Jewish identity, starting in the early 1960s and becoming even more the case over the next several decades. Jews in the last 30 or so years have tended to follow general kind of common religious trends in America. One of these is that the largest group, and regularly there are polls done of to try to identify the religious demographics of the country, see how people identify religiously. And the group that has grown by far the most over the last 3 decades or so are the nuns. And I don't mean nuns who wear habits and live in abbeys. I mean the N-O-N-E-S, right? People who say they do not have any religious affiliation. That they are either, simply that they might believe in God, but they don't affiliate with any religious organization. And just as there have been a lot of mainstream Christians who have become nuns, there have been a lot of Jews who have moved into that category. At the same time, there has been a general decline in the population, or the demographics, I should say, who identify with what we might call the mainstream Jewish groups. That would be the Reform and the conservative communities. And there has been an uptick in the more religiously conservative and religiously devout, especially the ultra-Orthodox and the charismatic Jews, which would mean the Hasidic communities. That there has been an increase in numbers, partly through the fact that these religiously conservative and devout tend to have much higher birth rates, and so their communities are growing the natural way, we might say. But more and more Jews who have a desire to be part of their religion have, been moving to these the charismatic pole, and they're usually religiously conservative. If they move to Israel, they tend to associate with the religious right. Jews traditionally in the United States have been very liberal, very much part of the Democratic Party, and this dates back to the Jews' intense support of the New Deal during the Great Depression. But that has become more complicated. Orthodox, given that conservative politicians in this country in the last maybe 20 years or so have taken up a louder and louder criticism of the state of Israel. Now, this is not to say that there is a real polarization over that issue. Politicians on both sides of the aisle in the United States tend to support Israel, just sort of as a matter of course. But there has been a greater tendency on the left to try to appeal to question the actions of the state of Israel, to bring the plight of the Palestinians into greater public consciousness, and to take a more, we might say, balanced approach. I'm not sure if that's the right word, but in any case, an approach that acknowledges that there are multiple sides of this issue, as opposed to just sort of blanket support of the state of Israel. And this has driven some Jews into to leave their kind of liberal democratic identification and to move into, along with the Christian right, to move into the conservative camp and to associate with the policies of the Republican Party. And that is really hyper generalizing things. But just as there has been religious polarization in the broader American community, in Christian America, there has also been religious polarization in the American Jewish community. And the Orthodox have grown in numbers. The more kind of mainline Reform and conservative synagogues have seen a dramatic decline in numbers, and more Jews who would be part of the liberal or progressive side of the political spectrum have dissociated from religious affiliation of any kind. Right? Okay. If you have questions about any of that, please post this on discussion board. I did want to draw a reference, and I'm not going to talk at great length about any of these, but just to give us a sense of where Jews live now. Right? This is a map, and this is, I think, counting fairly recent times, maybe 2017, something like that. But you can see where Jews live in the world in the largest concentration. And this even goes to the specific United States, right? Countries and states with a Jewish population higher than 100,000 people. Of course, there's a whole kind of conglomeration here in the northeastern part of the United States, especially in New York and New Jersey, Philadelphia, down to Washington, D.C., up to Boston, right? The whole eastern seaboard there has a large Jewish population. So does the Southeast, especially Florida, right? And this should come as no surprise if you're aware at all of the demographics of Florida. There are a lot of, especially Jewish retirees from New York coming down to Miami. There are also large Jewish populations sort of across the Sun Belt, Texas, Arizona, of course, California has large Jewish communities, as does Chicago and Cleveland, Cincinnati, places like that. One interesting one is Colorado. I would not have thought of Colorado as a state that had a Jewish population higher than 100,000 people, but apparently it does. I guess there are large Jewish congregations in Denver and perhaps in the communities of the Rocky Mountains there. Fairly significant Jewish population in Canada, and traditionally there has, and continues to be the case today, a significant Jewish population in Argentina and in Australia. South Africa is not in red here, but there are a fair number of Jews who live in South Africa, and so in the southern hemisphere it's really kind of three countries that have significant Jewish populations: Australia, Argentina, and South Africa. Brazil is approaching 100,000 as well, I believe. Israel, of course, is here, and we'll talk about that later. In Europe, France has the largest Jewish community. The UK, also a significant one, and that, of course, was one that was not destroyed during the Holocaust. So it was preserved and has a greater continuity. The French was more disrupted, but a fair number of Jews moved from North Africa, and we'll talk about, the mass migration out of the Muslim lands into Israel, and some Jews went from places like Algeria and Tunisia post-independence of those nations to France rather than Israel. And so I think that after the United States and Israel, France actually has the largest Jewish population in the world. I could be wrong about that, but I think that is the case. Interestingly, Germany, only in the last 40 or 50 years, obviously, I mean, almost all the German Jews were killed in the Holocaust, but Germany has actively sought to make its country a place where Jews were welcome, and where they could take up a life supported fully by the German government. Germany, of course, lent a great deal of support to Israel, in a way, I think, to atone for the Holocaust, right? This is a dynamic in Germany particularly, and so, many Jews have moved back there, and there's, I think, a population of about 120,000 Jews living mostly in the major cities of Germany: Berlin, Munich, Frankfurt, places like that. Russia, after the war, had a population of Jews in the millions still, maybe 2-3 million. Today it has a Jewish population only of maybe a couple 100,000 who still identify as Jews. By the way, if you're wondering, this little bit here is part of Russia. There's a tiny little segment right on the Baltic there that is Russian, around the city of Kaliningrad. But yeah, so if you're looking at that and wondering what this little tiny Eastern European country is that has a lot of Jews, that's part of Russia. But in the 1950s and 60s, and in the following decades, actually, a lot of these Jews from the Soviet Union ended up immigrating to Israel and adding to the Ashkenazic population there. In fact, a mass migration of Russian Jews moved to Israel, and this heavily influenced the shape that Israel took. And this is a fairly recent phenomenon. But there are still, a couple 100,000 Jews living in Russia. Okay, so I think that is enough to talk about now. So we'll move on and discuss the state of Israel next time. This will lead us into a conversation about the Brenner monograph, about the idea of Israel, and that will, fortunately or not, I guess, sadly or not, depending on your attitude here, take us to the end of the course.